Is religion outdated as a social force? Has religion done more good or more harm? Is Judaism preventing science from truly progressing? Why do you think it is that God created a mature universe? What would you say are some of the most challenging ideas when it comes to religion, blind faith? Is Judaism in favor of that? My name is Rafi Chemel, and today we have the pleasure of talking with Rabbi Yitzchak Schochet.
I am Rabbi Yitzchak Schochet from the Mill Hill Synagogue in London, England, and I'm here today to talk all about God, Judaism, and everything associated with it.
Okay, so Rabbi Schochet, we're going to jump straight in. Is religion outdated? Is it somewhat dogmatic or too dogmatic for the 21st century?
Religion is theocratic, not democratic. Things that are democratic are essentially subject to change and fluctuate with the moving times. So when it comes to democratic principles, you are essentially dealing with social contracts. Things like, for example, abortion can be in one instance deemed legal and in another instance deemed illegal. So it's always subject to change, but legal and illegal don't determine what is right and what is wrong. Religion is essentially absolute principles. Absolute principles determine what remains fundamentally right and what remains fundamentally wrong, and therefore is equally applicable throughout all the ages, in every era, and in all circumstances.
Is it fair to say, though, that the same principles that apply to people where they were holding 3,000 years ago should apply to us today? Aren't we more evolved, and shouldn't there be different rules for us, given how far advanced we've gotten?
We are certainly more evolved than we will have been 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But the fundamentals of civilization in terms of what determines right and wrong have to be absolute principles. Otherwise, you have anarchy. Otherwise, you have chaos. And that's why things like abortion are a pendulum that swings to and fro. One day okay, one day not okay, one day okay again, etc. That makes no sense when it comes to absolute values. Religion determines absolute values. They come from God. If God is eternal, then his absolute values remain eternal, are intended to be applicable throughout the ages in each and all and every circumstance, regardless of how advanced mankind has become.
Do you think that organized religion has done more good or more harm for the world at large, including those outside that faith tradition? So the general public, as a social force, has religion, organized religion, done good for the world?
Truth be told, the worst crimes in history have been perpetuated in the name of religion, in the West, no less than in the East. We Jews are perhaps more aware of this than pretty much everybody else. The Crusaders, the Inquisition, Martin Luther, pogroms in honor of Easter, Xmas, etc. Aboriginal people throughout the world recall missionaries coming to them with the cross in one hand and the sword or the Quran in the other and saying either you kiss this or this kisses you. I mean, how many wars have been fought and how many atrocities committed in the name of one faith or another? And all, of course, for the glory of God or with the battle cry, Allah Akbar. So what we have to consider is religion really at fault? I mean, were these criminals truly God's warriors? And the simple answer of saying no and to dismiss them as crazies or just ignorant fanatics is obviously too simplistic a response. I'm going to suggest to you something altogether different. In the gun control debate, there's a famous saying, guns don't kill, people do. And that's certainly true, though obviously in that context you have to wonder whether we should be facilitating and making it easier for people to behave improperly. However, the basic premise, well, that remains correct. Nearly everything in life is essentially a double-edged sword with a positive and negative side. So what we have to remember is that just as many people have been killed by following various secular social philosophies as by the propagation of certain theological beliefs. No less destruction was wrought by scientific research and discoveries or colonialist pursuits of wealth at the expense of native populations. It's not like this or that premise that's responsible for the consequences as much as what the human mind and so-called rationalism actually does with it. Are we going to suggest that we should now stop thinking and stop and cease scientific pursuits or stop developing social theories and philosophies? Obviously, that's absurd. So here's the point. Our rabbis of old were famously asked the question, if so many people are guilty of crude idolatry by worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets. So why didn't God just get rid of them and thereby preclude those mistakes? And the rabbis famously answer, what, you want God to destroy the world by depriving it of these necessary entities just because of some foolish people? The same applies in this context as well. When we ask the question about religion, abuse doesn't mean that we're going to stop legitimate use. What we have, our greatest gift as mankind, is the power of free choice. And that has to allow, obviously, a possibility of misuse, of abuse, of distortion, etc. The natural resources and the potentials that exist in our world, which includes, of course, our own rationale, our own human reason, our pursuit of religion, that's not what needs to be changed. We as human beings have to change. And we have to realize our positive potential, and we have to realize religion's positive potential by utilizing everything for its intended purpose to make this world the better place that God always intended for it to be.
What would you say to someone who claims that religion is preventing science from truly progressing? Does religion get in the way?
To suggest that religion gets in the way of science's progress is sheer absurdity, because the reality is that many great scientists over the course of time, even famous NASA scientists, ultimately embraced religion by being able to perfectly reconcile the two. My problem is with the many who become apologists and try to make religion better blend into science when there's really no need for doing so. By way of example, when it comes to the age of the universe, carbon dating is not an exact science. People, nevertheless, will insist, well, if science says that the world is billions of years old, then religion has to adjust itself, and therefore will argue that when it talks about 7 days of creation, it's not literal. Well, actually, yes, it is. And there's a much more practical explanation. Because in reality, God created the world in the first instance in a mature state. When man was put into the world, he wasn't put in as a newborn baby. He was put in as a grown, mature adult. So when you looked at him, you'd assume he might be 70 years old, 100 years old, whatever it is, when in reality he was but only 1 day old. And so it is with regard to the rest of the world as well. It was created in the first instance in a mature state, and in the famous words of our sages, those who want to come along and make a mistake, so be it. The point is, science itself will readily recognize that by no means is it exact. Even Darwin, and his own theory of evolution, wrote in a letter to one Asa Gray how the eye gives him a cold shudder, precisely because of the complexity of what goes into the very eye itself, and to suggest that somehow that evolved of its own, he recognized as being something of an absurdity. So science is not exact. Religion, on the other hand, is exact. It is absolute. It comes from God in the first instance. And therefore, it's not impossible to be able to reconcile science with religion. But by no means do we have to reconcile religion with science, and by no means does religion stifle the growth of science.
When you say that science is not absolute, what do you mean by that? Is it not in the pursuit of an absolute truth?
Fair enough, but it's in and of itself never exact, and the postulates continuously change all the time as we progress. So you can have a certain scientific theory that was embraced at a certain point in time, like people who believe that the world was flat, until at a certain later point in time you proved otherwise. So it's constantly evolving. And all the premises that might be presumed as exact today may not necessarily be exact tomorrow, and science itself readily acknowledges that reality. Religion doesn't change. Religion remains absolute, remains exact all the way through. It's not a case of what was then is not applicable today.
Why do you think it is that God created a mature universe to leave room for that error? If you had a chance to get into God's mind, why do you think God did it that way?
I think what we have to always bear in mind, above all else, is the concept of free choice. God created man in the divine image, which means he enabled us to be, as it were, godlike. To be created in the divine image, by definition, means that just as God has independent free choice, he also gave man that independent free choice. Fundamental to that free choice has to include the ability to make mistakes. And yes, God wants to reward us for making the right decisions, and therefore will enable there to be room for error, if you will, such that when we face the options, with the opportunity to make mistakes, but then still choose the right way, and then the reward remains eminently greater as well.
What would you say are some of the most challenging ideas when it comes to religion, or the greatest misconceptions out there? And what do people misunderstand?
I think the greatest misconception to religion lies in the Ten Commandments itself. People often ask the question, why did God have the need for there to be 2 tablets rather than just the one with all 10 commandments written on it? And there's this beautiful explanation about the fact that in as much as we tend to read the commandments vertically, they can also be read horizontally. So it's not just, I am the Lord your God, you should not have any other gods, etc., but I am the Lord your God, thou shalt not kill. And the significance of that horizontal reading is because there have been 2 groups of people that over the course of history ran the risk of completely demoralizing all of civilization. So for example, there were many, that is the Enlightenment movement, who embraced the idea of thou shalt not kill, but to the exclusion of I am the Lord your God. They believed that the world can function with embracing certain principles and negating the existence of God. The end result of that is the Holocaust, because then it becomes entirely a subjective interpretation of who you shall kill and who you shall not kill. And the result is the inevitable events of the Nazis determining that the Jewish people are a people that thou shalt not kill does not necessarily apply to, because they've taken God out of the equation. Conversely, there are certain religionists that have embraced the I am the Lord your God, but have negated the whole principle of thou shalt not kill, which means by definition, they unilaterally decided whom they can choose to kill when not embracing their belief in their particular God. And thus, as a result, you've had all kinds of terrorism over the course of history because there were those who did not necessarily embrace their belief and their religious way of life, etc., etc. So the significance of the Ten Commandments is precisely that which does away with the misconceptions of I can have a belief in God, but determine whom I can kill, or I can ensure not to kill, but decide who I should be allowed to kill and not kill, negating the existence of God. Both are absolutely essential. That horizontal reading is what is integral to ensuring that society continues in the absolute belief in God, in the absolute belief in the principle of thou shalt not kill, and thus maintaining a mutual respect for all of civilization.
So you're saying the misconception is also for the religionists?
The misconception is every bit for the religionists as much as the so-called Enlightenment movement.
There's this idea in the Torah that the Jews are commanded to annihilate the nation of Amalek. How does that square up with Torah being espousing these values that are timeless?
Amalek was a nation that sought to attack the Jewish people upon their immediate redemption from Egypt. The Torah makes a deliberate point of telling us that the nation were fatigued. It wasn't as that they were invading their land, that they were posing any real threat. They were just a tired nation coming out of 2 centuries of slavery. And all of a sudden, for no reason other than because, Amalek decides to launch an attack against the Jewish people. And in the words of the commentators, it kind of removed the awe and the reverence that the rest of the world had towards the Jewish people, essentially then making them ripe for attack by anyone and everyone. So Amalek represents what we often describe as pure personification of Jew hatred, of anti-Semitism. And to that end, therefore, we have to determine how we're going to respond to that, and the rights that we have uniquely in the context of Amalek to respond to that. To be sure, Judaism in no way, shape, or form condones genocide. Maimonides even makes the point when it comes to the Amalekites, you give them an option first. If they want to embrace monotheism, then you can allow for them to exist. If not, then that means that they remain fundamentally committed to the annihilation of the Jewish people. And to that end, therefore, you have to step up and launch your attack to annihilate them before they otherwise seek to annihilate you. Just think about it in the context of Nazis in the middle of World War II. Would anybody have an issue at that point in time of shooting Eichmann dead, assassinating Hitler, when they were posing a very real and direct threat to the very existence of the Jew? Amalek is unique in its personification of real anti-Semitism in every which way that we know it and can identify it. For as long as the Jew existed, Amalek remained absolutely committed to the annihilation of the Jew. So I have a choice to play nice and to just sit on the fence and argue, but hey, humanity, whatever, or take the necessary response of annihilating the threat to kill them before they will certainly otherwise kill me. Again, using the example, if I had the opportunity, and there were assassination threats against Hitler in 1938, there was already a demonstrated track record of what he was doing to mentally disabled people and other such like scenarios. And if I had the opportunity to kill Hitler in 1938, I would be able to absolutely argue that it was morally correct to do. And so it is in regard to the Amalekites as well.
So moving into the current day, are there any misconceptions that you feel people have about current Jewish practice, Jewish life, or religion in general as it's practiced today?
I think one of the greatest misconceptions about Judaism is that it's presumed that we're all about world domination. After all, the chosen people complex. We talk about Mashiach, universal salvation. We talk about universal laws, the Noahide laws, etc. The hard fact is that Judaism is the only non-proselytizing religion, where all other faiths insist that the only way you can come onto God is but through them. Judaism says, no, you have virtue in who you are and by the way that God created you, and you can seek to connect to God through your own faith and through your own means as you are. We don't proselytize. We remain committed in our own unique way to religion and respect all other faiths to find God in their own particular way as well. And by connecting through their own faith, I mean the idea of embracing the belief in God, monotheism, and the general universal principles that are integral to the stability of civilization.
But if someone seeks to convert, they could.
If somebody seeks to convert, we look to discourage it in the first instance, if only because it involves serious conviction and it involves serious commitment. It's not just something that you can jump on the bandwagon with and say, hey, wow, now I'm Jewish. Ultimately, if there's a demonstration of real conviction and real determination, then we will determine that and then embrace them wholeheartedly. Absolutely so. And the chosen people concept is not racist doctrine. To the contrary, I think if you are an adherent of any particular faith, you have to believe that you are in possession of absolute truth to the exclusion of all other faiths. Otherwise, you cannot claim to be a genuine proponent and adherent of that particular faith. Judaism maintains that it is the chosen people. And chosen people doesn't mean that we are in the first instance superior to you. It also means that we assume far greater obligation upon ourselves in respect to our responsibility to the outside world.
Do you think there are any psychological benefits of religion for someone practicing them, or is it something we do regardless of any psychological benefits?
It's certainly something we do without any psychological benefits, but there are clear benefits to religion that are essentially secondary to you, if you will, to the broader need to believe in the first instance. So, for example, when we talk about incurring loss, when there is loss that somebody endures, any kind of mishap, and even, God forbid, tragedy, religion in and of itself enables one to cope that much better. I have a distant relative who sadly lost a 4-year-old child whilst being walked by his father to shul on a Shabbos. And someone asked her during the week of mourning, how is it that you can continue to believe in God after this happened to you? To which she replied, it's only because I believe in God that I don't go completely out of my mind, that I know that ultimately there is a reason for this to have happened, albeit one that is well beyond human comprehension. Faith, belief in God, is not a pill you swallow, but a muscle you flex. In other words, it's not something external to you, it's something innate and intrinsic, and it's something that you're able to dig deep and reach into, especially when having to compete in the marathon of life. Another practical benefit of religion, faith, and belief in God is the principle of just really being happy, the idea of thinking good, and thus it'll be good. In other words, knowing that everything happens by divine providence, knowing that God is there, knowing that God ultimately wants the good for all and every single individual, knowing that God has my back, knowing that everything is by divine providence, enables me to remain in a better frame of mind when I'm going and navigating through the day-to-day grind of my existence. and knowing that God is there looking after me every step of the way. And finally, in that context, there's also the gratitude concept. In other words, things happen to me all of the time. I can always reflect upon them as being coincidences, or I can appreciate that a coincidence is really a miracle in which God is choosing to remain anonymous. And when I do that, I have a constant sense of gratitude to be able to appreciate the blessings that are existent and inherent daily in all of our lives.
Do you ever think it's too much, though, that maybe sometimes people lean into their belief in God too much to not actually confront the tragedy as it is? In other words, they're taking their belief in God as saying that all is right in the world without actually coming to terms with the fact that they suffered the loss that they did.
I've often heard it bantered about that people say, people use religion as a crutch to be able to cope with life's complexities. It's not what it is. In the first instance, you come into faith and belief through other means and by understanding and appreciating the existence of God. Thus, when something does happen, you're able to indeed fall back on that. But that doesn't mean denying the enormity of what happened to you. In the words of Elie Wiesel, who endured the depths of hell in the Holocaust, you can either love God or you can hate God, but you can't ignore God. And to put it in very different context, Abraham, the Torah tells us, cried when his wife Sarah died. Now, this is the super believer, the man who came to discover God of his own accord. Why is he crying? Why doesn't he just embrace the reality? This is part of God. Because he's a human being at the end of the day. And God created us as human beings with our own natural sensitivities. This is his wife. This was the love of his life. He endured loss, and so he cries. It's the first demonstration of outpouring of emotion in the Torah. But within that, when the Torah tells us that Abraham cried, it says, V'liv kota, and he cried over her with the letter Kaf smaller than the other letters, to demonstrate that it was grief, but it was a controlled grief. It was Abraham feeling, as a human being, the natural emotions of the loss endured, not denying them, but nevertheless tempering that with the reality that ultimately there is a divine plan, and that helps me navigate through the pain to be able to come out of the darkness into the light on the other side.
There's an expression out there called blind faith. Is Judaism in favor of that mentality, or is Judaism more in favor of a more rational approach to religion?
I don't think the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. The verse, as we recite 3 times daily in our prayer service, says, and you shall know today, and you shall turn to your heart. Knowing today is the intellectual, rational pursuit. Turning to your heart is more the idea of embracing blindly. And in reality, it's essentially a blend of the two. There's a common expression. To the believer, there are no questions. To the non-believer, there are no answers. Judaism is made up essentially of 3 types of laws: testimonials, reflecting the different festivals and occurrences throughout history; statutes, which are what we might call supra-rational principles that we adhere to purely on the basis of blind faith; and rational principles, which we adhere to on account of the fact that they make sense and they are conducive to civilization. But to be sure, even those rational principles, ultimately, we don't adhere to because they make sense to us. When left to the devices of man's own intellect, you end up with a situation where that which makes sense to me, I'll embrace, and that which doesn't make sense to me, I'll reject. The statutes are there to condition me to adhere to God's word regardless of what appeals to my own sensibility and what doesn't. So to be sure, I'm not meant to just embrace everything blindly. And ultimately, I am encouraged to pursue, to understand. If you're going to memorize the lines, but you're not going to master the technique, you're going to get stuck. Hasidism is a beautiful example of what gives us beautiful, deeper insight into everything that I'm doing and my whole existence in this world. But beyond all that, in the first instance, I do what God wants me to do for no reason other than the fact that God wants me to do this.
On a personal level, is there one Jewish idea that when you first encountered it really moved you, that you can remember distinctly?
I grew up with a father who made it his life's mission to deal with comparative religion. and indeed, admittedly, to combat missionaries who were always seeking to draw Jews into their faith. And he always made one key point that stuck with me. I'm not here to attack you. I'm just here to tell you to leave my boys and girls alone. Leave my boys and girls alone, and I'll leave you alone. By definition, there should be a mutual respect. We're not here to beat down on different faiths, etc., etc. We have to have a mutual respect for all of humanity, and that's the broader ideal that I was brought up with. But by the same token, I need to, at all costs, and to whatever extent, defend my own faith, especially in the face of others who might otherwise seek to delegitimize it, to attack it. And that's something that, sadly, we've encountered from the beginning of time, whether through anti-Semitism, through later times, through missionizing, and even today with the manifestation of anti-Semitism. So I live it, I see it, I experience it, and I'm hell-bent on defending it to every possible extent.
Well, Rabbi Schochet, it was an absolute pleasure sitting with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
It was a pleasure to be here with you, and especially discussing what is such an integral subject matter in our 21st century, where there's so much moral chaos in our world.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see others like it, then subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell below.